Many Magic the Gathering players ask the question, is it worth it to buy a Pioneer Challenger deck? Sadly, many Magic the Gathering players may also ask the question, what is Pioneer? The format has had a rough few years, in no small part due to the impact a lack of in-person events and tournaments has had on the format, to the point that many players either assumed it was gone or, worse, never heard of it to begin with. Well, don't call it a comeback, because Pioneer never really left, and with Modern more expensive than ever, thank you Modern Horizons and Modern Horizons 2, Pioneer may just be the budget-friendly, non-rotating format for those looking to jam 1v1 games. Wizards of the Coast certainly is supporting it by offering these pre-constructed Challenger decks, intended to be competitive and playable right out of the box. But would you really want to spend $40 to $50 a deck and play with one at GP Vegas? Let's take a look. A Pioneer Challenger deck contains the following. One playable right out of the box 60-card deck featuring cards from Return to Ravnica through Kaldheim, a 15-card sideboard making for a total of 75 cards. Some decks have up to 5 double-sided tokens, that varies of course depending on if the deck generates tokens, and of course the basic cardboard deck box that holds 75 sleeved cards. And yet again, there is no card for digital redemption, which continues to be absurd, especially when this is obviously an effort from Wizards of the Coast to support or even save the Pioneer format, certainly to promote it. Put a dang code in there to get these decks on Magic Online at the very least. Then people can play Pioneer in paper and play Pioneer digitally and maybe get their sparks reignited for the format. Just how much do these decks cost? Standard Challenger decks had a clear MSRP of $29.99, but since Wizards of the Coast no longer reveals MSRP, we are going by a little guesswork. I can say that they are charging more for these, as polling local game stores revealed that the usual pricing for standard Challenger decks, and here I'm talking about the cost to the game store, was about $144 for a box of 8 of the standard ones, but for these Pioneer ones, they're paying $240 for a set of 8. So that means that with that MSRP of $29.99, game stores were getting about $10 a sale. So if we were to apply that exact same profit to these, saying that game stores should get about $10 for a Pioneer deck sale based on what they're paying for distributors, then these would be about $39.99 each, which is actually lower than I'm seeing them for. TCG Player has them at $47.99 each. Card Kingdom, sponsor of this channel, has them for $44.99 each, though I have seen them at $39.99 at local game stores I've visited, and looking at other online marketplaces, I see that's the bottom of the spectrum and the top being about $49.99. Not to get off topic, again, sorry, but this is where a clear MSRP from Wizards of the Coast would help us as consumers to know the difference between a fair deal versus a good deal versus an unfair markup. Were these intended to have an MSRP of $39.99, $44.99, or $49.99? Based off the distributor pricing that I've seen and comparing it to the standard Challenger decks, in this video, I'm going to work off of the premise of $39.99, which is, I believe, a fair parallel to standard Challenger decks, but so just what is your $40 or possibly $45 getting you? There is indeed some hot value in these decks, that's for certain. Challenger decks tend to lean more heavily into having 3 to 4 copies of cards, even including rares. So the Lotus Field Challenger deck, for example, has playsets of Lotus Field, Thespian Stage, and playsets of commons and uncommons like Opt and Sylvan Scrying, cards that, while not terribly expensive by themselves, still add to the overall quality of the deck competitively, but I'll get to gameplay in just a moment. If you were to buy the singles for these decks to construct them yourself, as of release, Friday, October 15th, you would pay for Azure Spirits, $81, for Lotus Field Combo, $84.80, Mono Red Burn, a bit less at $60, and Orzhov Auras, $69. Nice. In addition to these being 100% reprints, there's a few unexpected collector pieces in them. Of particular note is the Orzhov Deck's copy of Luris of the Dream Den. To my knowledge, this is the only paper companion ever printed with the correct Oracle text, since the card type received an emergency nerf and rewrite. I think that makes the Orzhov deck have unexpected value just on that alone. Approach of the Second Sun also features the previously exclusive Magic Arena artwork, and considering that that's a card of other formats, especially Commander, this too adds a nice quality to the Lotus Field deck. But yes, looking at those numbers, financially there's a bit of an imbalance, with Spirits and Lotus Field being very financially worth it, and Orzhov Auras and Mono Red being less so. Though, I will add that the real goal of these is that you can spend your $40 to $50 and get a playable, right-out-of-the-box Pioneer deck. And so while it is interesting to see the financial value of buying the singles, I want to put the emphasis of this video and my evaluation of these decks on just how well they play. How good of a Pioneer deck is the deck in Pioneer? Which brings us to the gameplay conversation. Which Pioneer decks are each of these based on? How well do they compare to their fully developed competitive counterparts? Well, the Orzhov Auras deck is quite similar to the Shram Auras decks that one would find in the current Pioneer metagame. While this deck has failed to crack the top 8 in the MTGO Pioneer League over the last couple weeks, it has had a strong showing over the last couple of months. Remember, this is a non-rotating format. The deck is pretty well equipped to dive right into competition. However, a few changes would likely be a good idea. The deck comes with a full playset of Selfless Saviors, where it only needs 1 or 2, and in their place, some aggressive creatures such as Favored Hoplite would serve you much better. In the sideboard, Hushbringers could easily be switched for some efficient removals such as Fatal Push or even Legion's End. And that's probably nitpicking more than I need to, but there you go. A common theme throughout these decks, and let's be honest, precons in general, is the mana base. By no means the weakest among these decks, some Godless Shrines and the on-color Pathway lands would dramatically increase this deck's consistency, and it's a shame they weren't included. Especially since the point of Challenger decks is that they cost more so that Wizards can give you more. So if we're getting into the territory of now $39.99 or possibly $49.99 Challenger decks, well, shouldn't the mana base be a lot better than this? Ah, good old Mono Red burn. The deck here is pretty solid to start off with, since it is Mono Red, the mana base is blissfully simple, but some other inclusions definitely deserve more scrutiny. Bomat Courier seems a curious choice when something like Eidolon of the Great Revel or Bloodthirsty Adversary would have made a lot more sense. Likewise, Magma Spray has no business being in the sideboard when cards like Shock and Now Play with Fire exist. And since it's Mono Red, the mana base is just fine as is, but throwing in a couple Den of the Bugbears would have been a nice decision. Even so, this deck is pretty solid, and its counterpart in the meta sees a fair amount of play. It's interesting that while the most powerful and prevalent combo decks in the Pioneer metagame are currently Jeskai Ascendancy, followed by Winota, Wizards decided to deliver us Lotus Field. Now this is actually a pretty good example of the deck, though regrettably it contains neither an Ugin, the Spirit Dragon, nor an Emergent Ultimatum package. The mana base here isn't terrible, though some breeding pools instead of those Temple of Mysteries would have been a nice touch, as would a copy of Blast Zone. There are 2 copies of Shifting Ceratops in the sideboard, a perplexing choice for a combo deck. I mean, who tries to win fairly with combo? The point of combo is to win through degeneracy, but I digress. It's just 2 copies of 1 card. The biggest issue with this deck, however, is that it has a rather poor track record in the meta as of late, particularly when compared to the other 2 combo decks I mentioned above. Now that's not saying that this isn't still a fun and solid deck to play, even if it isn't the most in vogue right now, and it easily has the best mana base out of all of these decks. Azure Spirits was actually the most disappointing to me, which is too bad because Azure Spirits and its mono blue and banned counterparts are major players in the current Pioneer metagame, showing up in numerous top 8s over the last few months and beyond. And while this Azure Spirits deck is in many ways the most similar to its non-precon counterpart, it's still so much more disappointing. The base of creatures is there for the most part, missing a second Selfless Spirit, and perhaps a couple Skyclave apparitions, but the mana base is absolutely atrocious. 4 Temple of Enlightenments, 2 Glacial artificial fortresses, 7 plains and 10 islands, 17 basic lands and 4 tap lands, no hollowed fountains, no henge gate pathways. Wow. Not only is this easily the worst mana base of the 4 decks, but talk about self-sabotaging. Anyone trying to play with this spirits list without upgrading the mana base is going to be hindered greatly by those tap lands and basic lands. Again, this is so frustrating. It's like Wizards just will not let up on the mana base in precons. But here, like I said, you're paying a premium price in order to have a deck that is ready to play, and they can't put shock lands in there for Pioneer? It's just absolutely flabbergasting. What an absolute shame, because Spirit decks are among the best in the format right now, and this could have been an incredible jumping off point for players, but instead it needs some serious work and some serious money to be competitive. Oh, and why is Brazen Borrower in this deck? That doesn't make any sense. Lastly, I do want to comment on the recurring arbitrary nature of pricing these decks at all. This is the exact same number of cards as standard Challenger decks, and if you compare them to the value of the singles at the time of purchase, still more or less the same level as standard Challenger decks. So why are these more expensive then? It's the same product, the same contents in terms of materials. It's just more expensive because it's for a non-rotating format. Commander precons are 100 cards, cost the same as these Pioneer Challenger decks, and arguably have more single card value in them. I think, especially after seeing the release of $19 Commander decks, which soon got swept under the rug as the price returned to double that Wizards of the Coast is going to need to reevaluate how they price and value some of their products. If the goal here is to promote and popularize the Pioneer format, wouldn't the best way to do that be making these decks $29.99? Fetch lands aren't even legal in Pioneer, so why are you afraid of sticking a shock land in these decks? Stick a digital code in there, and you'll see an explosion of interest in the format. As is, I can't blame many Magic the Gathering players for remaining skeptical. Final conclusion, my top pick is Orzhov Auras. While it may not have the greatest reprint value, I feel it is very similar to its counterpart in the meta. And even if you're paying as much as $50 for this, it's still a quarter of the price of that counterpart. Out of all of them, I would be most likely to take this one down to my local game store and play it in an event. It's an A-. Next, both Lotus Field Combo and Mono Red Burn are solid examples of their respective decks. And while Lotus Field Combo may not be super popular right now, it's still a very fun deck to play. Both of these decks deserve a solid B. Finally, we come to Azure Spirits, the deck that I like least and I feel everyone is overvaluing. While its counterpart is probably the strongest deck of the 4, the amount of upgrades necessary to make this deck's mana base viable means all it's getting from me is a C. Fine, get it if you want, it's satisfactory, but they really could have omitted that Brazen Borrower and given us some shock lands. But now I want to hear from you. I especially want to hear from you with this video because do you think Pioneer has legs? Do you like Pioneer? Have you heard of Pioneer? Do you plan to play it now that paper events are returning? Are you picking up a Challenger deck or building a Pioneer deck of your own? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video has been of some help to you, perhaps you can help me out by remembering to like, share with a friend, or hit that subscribe button and ring that bell.